Hello viewers, let us discuss the topic political obligation in Western and Indian political thought. The problem of political obligation is one of the most complex issues in political philosophy. Now, what is political obligation? Political obligation is concerned with the question how far, when and why an individual is obliged to obey the laws of the state. Can the individual disobey or revolt against the laws of the state? Or can the individual provide partial obligation to the state? Now, before we move on with whether an individual has the right to obey or disobey, we need to understand what are the obligations of the individuals towards the state. It is an individual's obligation to abide by the duties of the state, to pay taxes regularly, to offer jury service, to offer military service as and when required, as well as maintain the laws of the state. Now, this issue of political obligation has been dealt in varied ways by Western political theorists and Indian political theorists. To provide a comparative understanding of political obligation in the West and in India, this lecture is divided into two broad areas. First, we'll try to provide you with an understanding with the idea of political obligation as it emerged in the West and what were the principal theories advocated in favor of political obligation. Then we'll try to locate the concept of political obligation in ancient Indian texts and whether the public had to offer absolute allegiance to the state or they had the right to revolt against the laws made by the Hindu kings. Now let us try to understand political obligation from the Western perspective. All the theories on political obligation offered by Western theorists can be broadly divided into two broad areas, which are theories of unlimited political obligation and theories of limited political obligation. Theories of unlimited political obligation covers those theories which pronounce absolute obligation of the individual as the primary duty, which says that loyalty to the state is unconditional and absolute. There is another set of theories which provide for limited obligation, and it says that the individuals have the right to disobey the laws of the state under certain circumstances. Let us start off with the theories of unlimited political obligation. The first theory which pronounces the concept of unlimited political obligation is the theory of force majeure, which also speaks about the role of force in ensuring citizens' obligation and allegiance to the state. Let us try to have a snapshot about this Western theory of force. The doctrine of force majeure regards the superior strength of the ruler as the source of political obligation. According to this view, the state is so powerful that the individual has no other option but to obey the laws made by the state irrespective of whether he likes it or not. In this sense, political obligation is based on the fear of punishment or other unpleasant consequences which follow from disobedience to law. This view of political obligation identifies the institution of state and government as the embodiment of absolute political authority, its invincible power as the source of authority. Therefore, the theory of force explicitly states that individuals have unconditional and absolute loyalty or allegiance to the state. The second important theory popularized by Western scholars about unlimited political obligation is the theory of divine origin. The theory of divine right of kings hold that the authority of the sovereign is derived from God, hence obedience to the state is as imperative as obedience to God. The king is not accountable to anyone, but the subjects are accountable to king, who is the representative of God on earth. This theory was popularized by Robert Filmer, who said that since God's will is binding on all mortals, this theory upholds an unlimited political obligation, and this theory speaks about the absolute right of the monarchs or kings to command unlimited obedience from the general mass of citizenry. There is another theory on unlimited political obligation. We call it the views of the conservatives. The most important idea around unlimited political obligation, as expressed by the conservative thinkers, is that it is more easy and better to obey the laws of the state, and the consequences on not obeying the laws are so unpleasant that it brings in more discomfort, and hence individuals should start obeying all the laws of the state. Conservative thinkers believe that there are certain practical reasons for obeying the laws of the state. David Hume, for example, argued that the advantages of obedience to any type of political authority far outweigh the disadvantages of having no government at all. He therefore upheld unlimited political obligation in view of practical utility of a government. Along similar lines, Edmund Burke, another conservative philosopher, argued that politics was a matter of prudence and practicability. So in the practical order of things, it was necessary and important that individuals obey the laws of the state. According to him, he contended that revolution is evil, not only because it produces violence and destruction, but also because it results in misuse of power by those who manage to capture it. Thus we find that both David Hume and Edmund Burke were in favor of unlimited political obligation because of the practical utilities coming from absolute obedience to laws. Now, these were the theories advocating unlimited political obligation. Let us now move on to those theories which propound and advocate limited political obligation. That means limited allegiance to political authority. The first theory advocating limited political allegiance is the very famous social contract theory. The social contract theory was advocated by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and J.J. Rousseau. Each of these theorists provided a different view of the social contract, necessitating the need for limited allegiance and how far individuals had a right to disobey the laws. The social contract theory justifies the principle of consent, which means the consent of the subject should be taken before a law is made, because the law affects all, and what affects all should be decided by all. Now, according to the view of the fact that the social contract led to the emergence of the state, it is premised on the idea that man is born free, and therefore free will should guide his allegiance. The thinkers who postulated this idea of consent as important for political obligation focused on the need for a contract between the ruler and the ruled. Now, before they moved on with consent, each of these three advocates that I just mentioned, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, provided a description of the state of nature before the emergence of the state. While for Hobbes, the state of nature was a state of brutish, solitary, nasty, poor, short. On the other hand, for Locke it was a state of tranquility and peace, but there were some problems which led to the creation of the state. For Rousseau, it was also a state of prosperity and tranquility, but with the rise of family and complications related to property, the state became necessary. Now, all these three advocates provided for some sort of a contract between the ruler and the ruled, by virtue of which political obligation was established. Hobbes, for example, postulated one contract by virtue of which the people surrendered all their rights to a monarch who had unconditional absolute authority over the people. The people had only one right for themselves which they did not surrender, and that was the right to self-preservation, or what we commonly say, right to life. Now, because according to Hobbes, the people surrendered all their rights, they lost the right to revolt against an unjust king. But this was not the case with John Locke's contract. Locke proposes a contract wherein people surrender their rights partially, so much so that they retain the right to life, liberty, property, and the right to resistance. For Locke, the people had the right to remove the authority if the authority was arbitrary, despotic, and anti-people. Thus, while Hobbes postulated absolute political obligation, Locke provided for limited political obligation and the right of the people to depose a ruler if the ruler was anti-people. Rousseau, on the other hand, is considered to be the harbinger of popular democracy, and he considers the fact that the people surrendered their rights to a general will, which was the common will of all. Here, since the people are themselves partners in government, Rousseau's logic was that the people will never make laws for themselves which they themselves will not obey. Therefore, Rousseau also provided for absolute political allegiance because people are the makers of the laws, and they who make laws will definitely not make anti-people laws for themselves. Thus, we find in this principle of consent, there are different types of obligation of the people towards laws. But one thing is common here, there is an implied explicit consent of the people in this entire context of lawmaking. Laws were made by the people for their own benefit. Let us now come to another very important area, that is, what happens if the laws do not reflect popular will. T.H. Green, one of the very famous thinkers, have postulated that no government of the world can claim an unlimited absolute political allegiance. He was of the view that for some extent force can be the basis of obedience, but force cannot work in the long run. He made a very interesting statement. Will, not force, is the basis of the state. So it is people's will which is the foundation of political obligation or the will to follow the laws of the state. Green argued that individual owes his allegiance to the society, not to the state or to the government. Accordingly, the organized power of society should be recognized as political authority for the purpose of determining political obligation. Green's concept of political obligation is based on the concept of common good. If the government makes laws in the interest of common good, people will definitely obey those laws. But if the laws are not in the interest of common good, people have the right to disobey such laws. Likewise, Harold Laski ruled out unconditional obedience to any political authority. He says that there is a distinction between state and government. The state can claim unconditional obedience does not mean the government can also claim it, because the government is a temporary feature of the state and governments come and go, but the state is permanent. Therefore, it is in the interest of the general public that if a government claims allegiance of human beings, it would have to compete with other human associations operating in that state at that point of time. So the government cannot claim absolute sovereign power, and on that logic, people have to obey the laws of the state. Therefore, Harold Laski argued that the government should work in the interest of the people to claim absolute allegiance or absolute obedience. Now, we need to understand one thing, that Western political thought in clear terms laid down clear theorization of political obligation. There was clear mention of which laws to be obeyed and which laws could be disobeyed. There was a notion of disobedience to political authority under exceptional circumstances. Western theories opined that disobedience can be tolerated, but then disobedience should not become a daily feature. Let us try to understand whether we have similar notions of political obligation allegiance in Indian political thought or not. Now, we need to understand that clear-cut conceptualization of political obligation may not be found directly in Indian political literature. However, conceptualization of state and kingship gives us ideas on how far the people have the right to obey and disobey the laws of the state. Altekar, in his book State and Government in Ancient India, holds the view that the concepts of Purushartha and the Saptang played an important role in determining the basis of political obligation. According to Altekar, both the government and citizens are to work in unison to make the political system function well and effectively. Rights and duties of both the ruler as well as the ruled were always looked upon as complementary rather than conflicting theories. State in ancient India claimed absolute allegiance because there was no other civic corporate body to compete with the state. And therefore, since the state was the upholder of dharma, state ruled in the interest of dharma, therefore people automatically had the allegiance towards the state. Now, just like Western theorists argued the divine right theory as the basis of political obligation, we find similar theorization in India also. We can speak about the divine right theory of kingship and the social contract theory, which may not be completely similar with the Western theorization, but at least there is some points of similarity between the Western concepts of political obligation and the Indian concept. For instance, the divine right theory of kingship postulates that the institution of kingship and the state is a divinely ordained institution. In the Atharva Ved, the king is associated with Lord Indra. The Satpatha Brahmana repeatedly identifies the king with Indra. The king rules and commands obedience because he is the representative of the supreme creator. In obeying the state, actually the people are obeying Prajapati. Thus, in Satpatha Brahmana, the king's divinity is offered directly as an explanation and justification of his authority. Obeying the king was equivalent to obeying God. Similar idealization can be seen in Kautilya's Arthashastra. The Arthashastra postulates the idea of king's divinity. To quote, "Whoever disregards kings will be visited with divine punishments also." It is the king in whom duties of both Indra and Yama are blended. Thus, the authority of the state has divine sanctions. A breach of the king's order is not just a crime, it is a sin also. In the Matsya Purana, it was said that the king was created by Brahman. The Bhagavad Purana lays down that even a sinful monarch should not be disregarded by the people, for every monarch embodies the rigor of Lokapalas or the protectors of the universe. So, obeying the king was equivalent to obeying the creator of the universe. Similar conceptualization can also be found in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata postulates not just the divine right theory of kingship, but also the social contract theory. The Mahabharata speaks that the king is divinely ordained and he is a representative of Lord Vishnu. No one should obey the king by taking him to be a man, for he is in sooth a great god in human form. Thus, the king was considered to be God himself. Narad Smriti preaches the duty of the subjects to submit to the king's commands. Whatever the king does is always right. Don't you think, students, this is similar and akin to the Western precept that the king can do no wrong? Thus, we find similarity in both the Western and the Indian conceptualization of political obligation, where the institution of kingship was given a divine representation, and out of fear of committing a sin, people followed the dictates of the king. Another important area that need to focus is Aitariya Brahmana, which though provides for divinity in the king's institution, but also speaks about choosing the ruler. Indra was made the king of gods because he was the most powerful and the most valiant. In fact, the story goes that the gods, with great god Prajapati, deliberated upon the choice of Indra, as he was the most vigorous, the most strong, the most valiant, the most perfect, who carries out best any work. Thus he was installed as the king. And since he was chosen by all, he would naturally be followed by all. So far we have studied about divinity of kingship. But in an age when monarchy was the most popular institution of government, were there any contracts between the people and the king in terms of expressing their allegiance to the ruler? Let us look into two chapters in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata. One is the 59th chapter, the second one is the 67th chapter of the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata. Both these chapters are necessary to examine this idea of social contract and how it varied in these two texts. All scholars who have studied the Shanti Parva have indicated elements of the contract theory found in these two chapters of the Shanti Parva. The first chapter provides for certain features of social contract as the basis of political allegiance. For instance, it says that the ruler is of divine origin and the people were not part of the contract. It was a contract between the Brahmins, Rishis or the sages and the king. People were not consulted here. These legends are reminiscent of the Hobbes' theory of social contract, where the sovereign had absolute power and his right was irrevocable. Now we find a more democratic theory of social contract in the 67th chapter of the Shanti Parva, which says that conceptualization of the state can be found and located in the idea of Matsanaya. Matsanaya was like Hobbesian state of nature, a state of anarchy, chaos and disorder. Terrified by anarchy, people made an agreement amongst themselves. So what did the people do? People approached the supreme creator Brahma for a lord who would be worshipped by them and who in return would protect them. Brahma asked Manu to be the first king. What is interesting to note, Manu did not accept the proposal. He said, and I quote, "I fear all sinful acts. To govern a kingdom is exceedingly difficult, especially among men who are always false and deceitful in their behavior." Manu refused to participate as the governing authority as postulated in the 67th chapter of the Shanti Parva. The people requested him again. And now there was a contractual obligation. It was said that the people requested him to rule in return of money, materials and metals. They promised to pay him 1/50th of the cattle, 1/50th of gold and 1/10th of grain for increasing his treasury. They also promised that those who would become the foremost in the use of weapons would follow Manu like deities following Indra. He was also assured of 1/4 of spiritual merit which the subjects protected by king would earn would accrue to the king. Thus we find that there was a contractual obligation between the king and the people in the 67th chapter of the Shanti Parva, which said that the king would rule in exchange of grains, cattle, and gold. We also find evidence of social contract theory of political obligation in other scriptures also. The Mahabharata goes a step further in not just postulating a contract but also giving the people the right to resist, which was unfound at that period of history. In other texts, the concept of a tyrannical king and what should be done to him goes unnoticed. In other words, other scriptures refuse to accept the fact that kings could be disregardful of people's interest because they would always be governed by Raj Dharma. Mahabharata, however, gives the people the right to revolt. It also offers certain spiritual and religious sanctions against the king. If the king is unwilling to or unable to carry out his part of the contract by protecting the people and ensuring a prosperous government, they should forthwith kill him like a mad dog. This is the only exception that we found in the entire ancient scriptures speaking about the right to revolt. While we have studied about the Manusmriti, Aitareya Brahmana and the Mahabharata, we should also try to understand how Kautilya explicates the idea of social contract. It states that overtaken by a state of anarchy, the people elected Manu as their king. Kautilya's Arthashastra also speaks about Manu being elected as the king and being offered 1/6 of grain and 1/10 of articles of merchandise in return of law and preservation of life. In return of these taxes, the king was supposed to maintain state welfare. Even the inhabitants of the forest were required to give him 1/6 of the forest produce. Thus, we find that there was a contractual obligation between the king and the people, whereby the king would receive certain taxes from the people and he would be an obligation to protect them. Let us move on to the theory of force. While in the West, the theory of force was one of the foremost theories providing for unlimited political obligation, we also find certain conceptualization of the theory of force in Indian political thought. The theory of force is postulated through the idea of danda or dand niti. It is said that people obey the laws out of the fear of dand, and it was also believed that dand should be as deserved, neither too lenient nor too harsh. In fact, it is the fear of dand or punishment which ensured that the people obeyed the laws of the state. In fact, Arthashastra, Manusmriti, Mahabharata attaches considerable attention to danda. Danda alone enables the king to enjoy the earth and the subjects to enjoy happiness. Force or coercion is not an end in itself. Its function is to ward off the law of fishes or Matsya Nyaya. The Sukraniti elaborates that the king is enjoined to make the subjects acquire the habits of performing their duties by the use of this terrible scepter, that's the danda. Now let us try to understand, can dharma be regarded as the basis of political obligation, because dharma was said to be the basis of ancient Indian state system. People were governed by different forms of dharma. Dharma was not just religion. It was a code of conduct governing people from their birth till death. People were engulfed through Swadharma, Varna Dharma, Ashram Dharma, and the king was supposed to rule in accordance with Raj Dharma. Thus, Dharma in ancient India was the basis of law and governance. Dharma determines the right relation between the state and the individual. Man has his duties towards his family, and if he fulfills them in accordance with the laws of Dharma, there would be no need to inflict punishment or to disobey the laws of the state. Political obligation, it is clearly said, is not conflicting with other obligations. It is said that obeying the king's laws was a part of the dharma of the people, just like obeying the rules of the varna or the ashram dharma or following general duties. Since the political dharma and the social dharma does not conflict, there is no question of disobeying the laws of the state. Let us try to understand what we have studied so far. We need to understand that the concept of political obligation has been dealt comprehensively by both Western and Indian political theorists. We also need to understand that political obligation is a highly complex issue. Therefore, the limits of political obligation needs to be analyzed and understood with careful examination. We also need to understand that individual owes political obligation to the political authority. Therefore, obedience to the laws of the state should be natural and right to revolt should be the last resort. Resistance to political authority may be needed at times to ensure that the government is kept in check. But we need to not lose sight of the fact that whether it is the Western theory of political obligation or the Indian theories on political obligation, both of them focus on the fact that the principle behind political obligation or obedience to the laws of the state is maintenance of social order. If everybody maintains social order, then we would be having a well-governed state where people can live their lives freely and in a proper regulated manner. Thus, political obligation is essential part of the government and we need to fulfill our duties towards the state in a rational manner. That's all for today. Thank you.